Hello, I'm Lugatorix, and today I'm going to be discussing how to defeat the Romans on Rome Total War. I've made videos on how to defeat the Germania faction in Rome Total War. I've also made a video on how to defeat the Egyptians, but today we are focusing on the Italian peninsula and facing off against one of the hardest factions to play against in the whole game. Now, this guide is specifically for factions that are non-Roman, particularly if you're going to be like the Gauls, for example, or Germania, or Carthage, or the Greeks. You're very likely to be facing off against the Romans, but let's face it, if you're going to try and get a large portion of the map, at some point you're going to come across one of the three main factions. But yeah, I won't be discussing the actual civil war mechanics today because I'm actually going to dedicate another video to that in the future. So yeah, we're just going to specifically discuss from the other factions' perspective. So, well, where did the Romans start? Most of you will probably know this already, but we have three factions. Well, actually four, but three playable factions. We have the Julii, the Brutii, and the Skippy Eye. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at the Roman army, the composition of soldiers they have, and I'm going to be discussing, sort of how to counteract their style of play on the battlefield, and I'm also going to discuss some sort of wider campaign strategy, how to defeat them on the campaign map. My main piece of advice for defeating Rome is basically go for Rome as soon as you can. There's many reasons why, and we'll be discussing that in greater detail, but my number one piece of advice is don't put off trying to tackle the Romans. I know it can be tempting, you might want to build up your force or whatever, particularly if you're like Gaul or Carthage or something, you might feel like, no, I want to consolidate the homeland. No, I promise you, going straight for the throat, going straight for the Italian peninsula is your best bet of survival for several reasons, which we'll discuss right now. So first of all, let's go into the army composition and I'll discuss what a Roman army looks like. Okay, so this is what a Roman army looks like. I've discussed this more in detail on my faction guides. The three Roman factions basically have identical armies. The only difference is they have slightly different gladiators, but that's very unlikely to actually make a difference in the campaign. Now, the most important thing about the Roman army is it's kind of split into two, in the sense that at the beginning there is the pre-Marian army. These armies are going to likely, consist a lot of Hastati. You're going to be seeing a lot, for example. You're going to be seeing Roman archers, Velites, Equites over here, stuff like that, okay? Now, for early game troops, pretty decent indeed, okay? Certainly not terrible, and they've still got a pretty diverse army. In fact, the Roman army is arguably one of the most diverse in the whole game, particularly in terms of infantry. The Hastati are certainly solid troops. They have a range attack, the missile, the peeler. They also have solid attack and defensive statistics, a fairly offensive unit, but they've also got more defensive units like... I found them, there we go, the Triarii, spearmen, not phalanx troops, but still are pretty decent in fighting cavalry and all that, and a more defensive unit. So, solid units, but nothing particularly amazing in the pre-Marian army. But I'm now going to discuss the first reason why it's important to try and take out the Roman factions quickly, and that is because, as many of you probably know already, if a Roman faction gets to a huge city, if you allow them to develop enough to get to a huge city, there will be the Marian reforms, and once the Marian reforms happen, it means that these old, kind of outdated, pretty average units get thrown out the window and replaced by vastly superior versions of themselves, basically. The Hastati that we've just seen over here, 7 and 14, they're okay. Now get replaced by early legionary cohort, 9 and 17, with a missile attack of 13. That's pretty damn solid. I know it's only Peeler, but still, short range, but good. Even better, maybe even the legionary cohort you might get, Praetorian cohort, or if you've really screwed up and you've really allowed the Romans to develop, you might be facing urban cohort, which are one of the most elite units in the whole game. I mean, talking of infantry, I would say probably a top 3 infantry unit in the whole game. I think most people would probably agree with that. They're on the level of like Spartan hoplites. In fact, I prefer these guys to Spartan hoplites personally. 14 attack, 24 defense, 18 missile attack. They are basically an unstoppable tank moving forward. And the Roman armies are going to be really tricky. Now, sure, you're going to upgrade your armies yourself, and with some factions, the Marian reforms won't make a huge amount of difference because actually you can tech up as well. You can kind of keep up with the Romans. But the thing is, some factions really just cannot keep up with these reforms. I'm thinking, for example, maybe if you're playing as a Numidia, really, you're not going to be able to keep up with the reforms. Spain, I would say, have a technological disadvantage at this point of the game as well. There are certain factions where their elite units, quote unquote, are nowhere near as elite as the Roman units. And also, the dangerous thing about the Marian reforms is, if you're, for example, you're going to maybe take up your barracks first, and then your cavalry, and then your archery range or whatever. It's going to be a slow process of taking up a stage at a time, a type of unit at a time. For the Romans, it all happens at once. They don't even have to make any more buildings or anything. Instantly, once those Marian reforms are passed, they instantly get better infantry, cavalry and missile troops. And sure, they can upgrade it further to get these super elite ones, but they instantly got upgrade across the whole board. Now, how to face a Roman army? How do they kind of set up? Well, pretty similar with both the pre-Marian and post-Marian army. The AI like to have their sort of frontline infantry. So in the early game, you'll be seeing a lot of hastati. They'll have a decent long line of hastati depending on how big the army is. Occasionally the triarii, but they don't tend to use the triarii as much. My main piece of advice with them is just don't charge a cavalry into them. Obvious stuff, they're spearmen. But the hastati are going to be there. They're going to have a few Roman archers in behind, probably a general, and then probably a couple of units of equites. I think there are two pieces of advice. The first piece of advice is don't be too defensive. Now, I quite like to play defensively in Roman Total War. It's why the Greek cities is one of my favourite factions. I like having a nice long line of spearmen, letting the army or the enemy come towards me, and then dealing with it from there and sort of making an impenetrable wall. The problem with doing that against the Romans are that so much of their infantry, basically all of it apart from the spearmen, have the peeler, have that range attack. And if the AI is clever enough, kind of depends what difficulty you go on, I guess, but if the enemy is clever enough, the hastati will stop for a second. They'll be out of the range of your spears, they'll throw the peeler, they'll do a decent amount of damage, particularly as the reforms go higher, their missile attack gets more and more dangerous. They'll weaken your front line massively, and then they'll charge in, and it suddenly becomes a lot more tricky dealing with the infantry. So really, if you're facing off against the Romans, you kind of want to charge them quickly, in my experience, because if they get that peeler off, it actually can be quite dangerous. Now, admittedly, the AI isn't really as clever as it could, maybe should be, and quite often the Romans will just charge blindly in any way without throwing the peeler. If they do that, then playing defensively isn't really an issue. In fact, hastati against spearmen, I would, in most circumstances, unless they're a crappy spearman like the Eastern Infantry, I would most of the time actually favour the spearmen. So that's not too much of an issue. It depends how clever the AI is going to be. For me though, when I'm facing off against the Romans, I really try and use the cavalry advantage most of all. Now in the early game, like we discussed, most of the time you're going to be seeing equites, to be honest. Now equites are okay, they're pretty fast, but they're not particularly sturdy and strong, and also the AI isn't particularly intelligent, so they're not going to use them to their full capacity. The important thing with facing a Roman army is, in my experience, is the infantry battle. It's the which line of infantry is going to survive longer. Is it going to be your spearmen or your infantry versus their infantry? And a great way of breaking their infantry when you're sort of in a deadlock on a knife edge is getting your cavalry around the side, around the flank, and hitting the enemy in the back, sandwiching them between a line of spearmen and cavalry. The hastati is going to break pretty quickly, and that's why you really need to have a cavalry advantage when facing off against the Romans. It's very important because you need to get that cavalry quickly around the side into the back, and then once their infantry's gone, they haven't really got a whole lot else to deal with. Cavalry is amazing in this game, but for me the Romans don't use it as well as they could do when you're facing against them. Okay, so now that I've discussed the general rules when you're facing a Roman army, I'm now going to go on to what is probably the more important part actually, which is the campaign map strategy. Not a huge amount to say, quite honestly, because I feel like with most of the factions, honestly, the tactics are going to be pretty much the same. My advice is going to be aggressive and all that, but we'll do it anyway. Let's go over to the campaign map and discuss how to defeat the Romans on there. So here we are, this is the Roman starting position. Obviously, you could be facing the Julii, Skippy Eye, Brutii, or potentially all three of them if you're unlucky enough. Now, the number one advice, and I alluded to this at the beginning of the video when facing the Romans, is be aggressive. Because they're going to be aggressive, so you might as well be. And there are two reasons why you want to be aggressive against the Romans. The first one is, of course, like we just discussed, you don't want them to be able to tech up so that they can get the Marian reforms. That's going to make your campaign a lot more difficult. But the second reason is the Romans are the most aggressive faction in the whole game. the most aggressive AI faction, and not only are they aggressive, but they are guaranteed to do well. The Skippy Eye might get off to a bit of a bumpy start, but overall, over the course of the game, if I clicked end turn 50 or 100 times right now, I guarantee the map would be mostly Roman by the end of it. And it's because the auto-resolve is basically kind of rigged so that the Romans win. The game wants the Romans to expand because that's kind of the storyline of Rome Total War. The three families expand, they get so big that actually they all believe they can take Rome for themselves, and then they sort of implode and have a big civil war, whatever. And the victor gets Rome. That's the storyline. Sorry for spoilers, I guess. That's the storyline of Rome Total War. So the Romans are pretty much guaranteed to win. And, you know, if the Julii, for example, are facing off against Germania has a horrible time on the auto-resolve because the game just doesn't respect phalanxes, for example. They will disrespect certain factions that really should win the auto-resolve. The Romans will win. You know, for example, Scythia as well are very much disrespecting on the auto-resolve. They don't value Scythia that highly on the auto-resolve. So the Romans are going to expand whether you do something about it or not. But it's best to try and do as much you can to sort of stymie them, I guess. Now, I guess there are sort of two circumstances where you're going to be facing off against the Romans. The first situation is, for example, if you're a faction like Gaul, Carthage, Macedon, or Greece, you're going to be facing off against the Romans pretty early on, where the Roman Republic is kind of just getting going. They might have 2, 3, 4 settlements, but it's certainly not a big empire at this point. And the second situation you're going to be facing the Romans is, for example, if you start off in the corner of the map, let's say Parthia, Scythia, Armenia, and actually by the time you've sort of reached the Italian peninsula, the Roman Empire should be pretty established, and actually you're going to be facing a bigger problem. Let's discuss the first circumstance first. This, oddly enough, can actually be more tricky because, alright, the Romans haven't got an established empire, but the thing is, you haven't got very high tech, particularly if you're a barbarian faction. You haven't got a lot of economy or settlements. You haven't really got going yourself yet. Actually, the playing field is a little bit more even. Later on in the game, you have the advantage of being a human, and actually, you know, you can read the situation better than the AI can and use your technological advantage against them. But in the early game, it actually can be a lot more difficult. My main piece of advice would be focus on the Romans solely. So, for example, if I was playing as Gaul, I would try and get as many alliances as I could. I wouldn't go to war with Spain, for example. I would try and sort of guide the Britannia towards facing off against the Germanics rather than myself. You know, try and get at least 2 alliances if I was Gaul. Then focus all of your armies, or most of them anyway, coming down here to the north of Italy and trying to take out Arretium and Ariminum. Now, for me, I prefer facing off against the Romans in the open field. I like fighting on the open field a lot more, so I would try and maybe attack one of their cities. Bear in mind, their cities are unlikely to be guarded that much. It's the big armies on the open field that are going to be the problem. Attack one of the cities, one of the big armies will come over and say, hey, you can't do that, and actually attack you. But I would have no qualms about going to war with the Romans. The only thing I would say is before you go to war, get your diplomat to talk to their diplomat. The Romans are fairly rich. Try and get a bit of money off them first. Now, something I quite like to do in the opening few turns, if you are going to do a surprise attack on the Romans before they can even react, if you are good enough at setting up, is setting up 2 armies and then trying to attack their 2 settlements simultaneously. Even if they're going for Segesta, for example, that's even better. It puts a lot of pressure on the Romans and they have to split their force up. I would argue that the Skippy Eye are the weakest of the starting 3 Roman factions in terms of when the AI is controlling them. And the main reason is it's hard for the Romans, the Skippy Eye, to get units from Capua to Messana. Sure, they do have a boat, but first of all, it's only 1 bireme, I think. Or, sorry, 2 biremes, so it's not a huge amount of naval force. But also, the AI isn't always 100% responsive. If you go and get a boat and attack Capua, as let's say the Carthaginians, it's unlikely that the Romans are going to get there in time for you to stop them. There's only 5 units on the Italian peninsula that are controlled by the Skippy Eye, and quite often this geezer will get on the boat anyway, so there's a chance there could be, you know, as little as 3 units there. So getting an army of at least 5 to 7 units of your own can take a couple of turns, get over to Capua, but once you get that slice of the Skippy Eye out, their empire is solely on Sicily, and they're going to have a lot more trouble. I'll admit, it is tough fighting the Romans in the opening game. That's why it's very important the first 2 battles are, the first 2 or 3 battles are very, very important and can set the tone of the whole campaign. Another thing you can do is try and predict the Roman moves and then get there before they do. I'm particularly talking about rebel settlements. For example, the Brutii are always going to go for Apollonia first, then pretty quickly they're going to go for Salona. Now it's tough to get to Apollonia before the Brutii. It is possible, but it is a little bit tough as well. But for example, going to take Salona, for example, before the Brutii gets there means that actually you have reduced their capacity to expand quickly pretty early on. The same with the Julii. If you want to try and beat them to Segesta, then that's a good opportunity as well, maybe. Or Segestica, for example. If you allow the Romans to get going, particularly the Brutii, getting 2, 3, 4 settlements, their economy is going to build up, you're going to get a lot more soldiers against you, and times are going to be tough. For example, if you allow the Brutii to get Apollonia and Salona, they go from only being able to recruit 2 units a turn to recruiting potentially 4 units per turn. They've doubled the capacity of their army potentially, and that could be a big issue. Really try and look at where the Brutii are likely to expand. If it's the Brutii, Julii, or Skippy Eye, look at where they're likely to expand and try and beat them to it first. That's a super good idea in my opinion. I'm now going to try and briefly discuss how to face off against the Romans if they've got a more established empire. For example, if you're the Parthians, by the time you get to sort of this kind of region, you've got through all of this, and you've got to like Greece, for example, the Brutii are more likely to be there and sort of conquered that kind of region already. What's my main advice? Well, I think the number one piece of advice if I was going to face off against the Romans is actually to develop a good navy. And that's for several reasons. Number one, a navy is good anyway because they can blockade ports. You can get troops around quicker and all that. And if you blockade a port, it means that when you attack them, first of all, they can't hold out for a siege as quite as long. But also, their troops, their army goes down quicker because more of the soldiers die because they can't get food or whatever, presumably, and all of that. And also, it restricts their economy massively. Well, let's say, I was the Egyptians and I had a strong navy. Rather than trying to sludge through all the armies of the Brutii that are likely going to be in the sort of Hellenic region, I would actually go for their core settlements in Italy. And there's several reasons for that actually. But the primary reason is, and this is actually a feature that is fairly typical of a lot of the factions when controlled by the AI, I mentioned it in my Egypt version of this video, is that, for example, if a faction is moving out and they're fighting against another faction, they quite often leave their home settlements quite poorly defended. These are basically a couple of free settlements you can take if the Romans essentially abandon them. And the great thing about that is, if you're prepared, if you get a couple of boats, a couple of armies, you can strike, let's say, Croton and Tarentum very, very quickly. You take the 2 settlements off them like that in the click of a finger, and immediately the Romans have got a dilemma because they're probably at war over here, or they've probably got their armies all the way over here. They're going to have to bring some of their armies back, and if they don't, they're just leaving all their territory vulnerable. And what it kind of does is it kind of splits up their army. You're kind of in an informal alliance with the other factions without them even knowing, because they're helping you out in this region essentially because they're at war with the Romans, but actually you can sort of slip through the back door and actually take them out like that. Once their forces split up, they can have a real tough time of knowing what to do, and you can just pick off the sort of vulnerable settlements. Another good thing about this is, again, as I kind of alluded to earlier, it reduces their capacity to actually produce more. Generally in Rome Total War, you don't want to be fighting out too much in the open field. It's much more important to take settlements. If you fight out in the open field, particularly against the Romans and the Egyptians, 2 factions who just produce hordes and hordes of armies, I would imagine if you looked at the game code, probably by cheating, it sometimes seems like they just cheat the amount of units they somehow magic out of nowhere. If you fight them on the open field, basically all you do is you wipe out an army, great, and the next turn another army comes out from Croton, Tarentum, Termon, Apollonia. They've just sort of spawned out of nowhere. If you want to reduce the chance of that happening, you've got to reduce their capacity to actually recruit, and that's by taking the vulnerable settlements and actually focusing on the areas where they're least expecting you to attack, the areas that they perceive to be pretty damn safe, but actually they're not because you're more clever than the AI is. So yeah, I would say they are my main pieces of advice when focusing off against the Romans. Again, when actually on the battlefield in the army, I would say be fairly offensive, use your cavalry to your advantage, get the cavalry around the side, try and sandwich their infantry as much as possible. Don't let them just throw peeler at you all day. That's not going to be fun. It's going to weaken you quite significantly. In terms of actually on the campaign map, try and take the rebel settlements before they do. Try and sort of proactively attack against them. Be super aggressive, but also if you do let things get a little bit out of hand and actually the Roman Empire starts getting big, the Italian peninsula is going to be very, very vulnerable. The Senate won't do a good job at trying to defend it. Because they're not going to come down to Tarentum and Croton that often. I don't see the Senate army wandering that far. Sometimes they will to Capua, but fairly rarely. And try and take off their vulnerable settlements, split up their force, and reduce. This is the crucial thing: reduce their capacity to just spawn millions of armies out of nowhere. I find that with the Roman army, once the Roman factions get out of control, it really gets out of control. If you mess around in the Middle East for 50 turns or whatever, and then you finally get over to this kind of region, the Mediterranean, you think, damn, okay, this is really out of control. There's a lot of Brutii, there's a lot of Scipii, there's a lot of Julii, and it can get really out of control very quickly. And of course, a very crucial thing as well, an obvious thing is, don't let them get the Marian reforms too early. That can be disastrous. Try and take that out before that happens. But anyway, that's my advice for taking out the Romans. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll be back with more very, very soon. I'll see you around.